First of all, we'd like to thank you for the wonderful No Beginning, No End album. We listened it quite a lot. It comes along very subtle, quite smooth, but it really catches you. Would you consider it as a statement against very music with many effects? And if so, is it important to you to create a handmade music?
I wouldn't call it a statement, but it's a sort of a reaction against my last album, Blackmagic, which was pretty much all electronic, which was cool. It was a cool experiment. I just missed working with a band. It wasn't any kind of like, I'm against electronic music because that's mostly what I listen to, but I wanted to work with a band. I think as a singer, as somebody who comes from jazz, I wanted to have that experience working together, with people. And also Leon Ware talked to me about how I used to write at Motown with bands, rehearse with bands. That's how they made it like so much better. Like having all these different minds in the room except for just you and your laptop. So yeah, it was a shift back towards more of a human thing.
Yeah. Your new album is a very unique piece of music, blending together jazz, hip hop, R&B, and electronic music. To me, you have created a new form of soul music.
Well, for this album, I just wanted to write music and just express it and not think about what style it was. And I think every track on the album is a different style, actually. You sort of have some Afrobeat, something more funky, more D'Angelo, more singer-songwriter, more pop, so I really just didn't want to have any categories. But I think soul kind of covers so many things, There's blues, gospel, jazz, rock, all mixed in together.
The cover of the new album reminds me on D'Angelo Voodoo cover. Which way is your music related to the music of D'Angelo?
Well, I have the same band on the album. Chris Daddy Dave on drums, Pino Palladino on bass, and he also co-produced it. And Russ Elevado, who engineered Voodoo, is also one of the engineers on the album, so there's a lot of connections.
Yeah, D'Angelo was a key artist of the neo-soul movement in the 90s. Pino Palladino, who is on your new album, said it, was part of the new soul movement. What was special on that kind of music from today's perspective?
I think just the freshness of it, like wanting to, it was very much a reaction against 80s production, again, not working with bands so much. Rock bands have always had bands.
Yeah.
We're talking about black music, I think it was kind of getting away from super produced stuff, getting back towards analog, referencing bands from the 60s and 70s, referencing Jimi Hendrix, referencing Sly too, referencing like all that kind of working together. And there's a certain vibe that just happens in the studio. Sometimes you write stuff that you wouldn't normally, you get into a groove. There's things that just happen when you're with people, with really great musicians. So I think that's, when I look back to, that's what I really like about it. What my critique is of that time is I feel like it got too groove oriented and not song based enough. And so then it went into this whole thing of, D'Angelo and Erykah Badu were like the best in that time. And then a lot of stuff came after that wasn't as good. That was just groove and the songs weren't that good. So I feel like it's time to kind of get back to songwriting again. Yeah. There's no way I would have been an artist without hip hop. There's no way I would have found out about jazz or soul without hip hop, through the samples. That's how everybody always asks me, how did I find out about jazz? Because, Ali Sheed, Muhammad, and Q-Tip were sampling jazz albums. It's that simple. So yeah. It's important. Also, like the way that hip hop uses loops and samples, I use that as a compositional tool when I write as well. So it's everything.
Okay. When you started your career, you Equionics by Coltrane with hip hop. What is the difference between the both, and where are the similarities?
Between Coltrane and hip hop?
Yes.
I mean, Coltrane, obviously it's different because it's all a band. And they didn't have electronic music, like instruments back then. So, instead, they're trying to find this vocabulary through instruments that they had, which were classical instruments, upright bass, saxophone, trumpet, piano. So it was a subversion of sort of a European instrumental setup, and hip hop was, that was very much a necessity. I think for hip hop generation, there's a lot of kids that didn't have that much money and didn't have, they cut a lot of band programs and stuff in the US. So kids didn't have access to those same schooling, that someone like Coltrane had or Miles Davis had, marching bands, school bands, college bands, all this stuff. So, instead you make a beat, somebody has a turntable, and it came out of that. I think it's the same essence, like when MCs do it like a freestyle, that's like improvisation, same thing. But the instruments have changed, I think hip hop took it one step further back to African music, where it's more about the vocal and the rhythm and less about harmony and chord changes and more European based stuff.
Okay. Yesterday on the concert in Cologne, you covered Ain't No Sunshine, that was originally produced by Booker T. What do you know about his work at Stax?
Booker T? Oh,
yeah.
Bill Withers?
His works at Stax.
Legendary, legendary stuff. Like all of that plus Al Green, and I'm trying to draw on that on this album as well. The interplay again, the band, the way the drums are up front and super funky. Like I wanted to blend all that in as well. So I try to drop, I try to put some Bill Withers, some Al Green, some Marvin Gaye in the set. Not every night, but if it's feeling really good, I try to include that to give people references. Because a lot of people who come to my shows are, a lot younger as well. And they don't necessarily know about Al Green or Marvin Gaye, or definitely not Bill Withers, So I think it's important for artists to kind of reference where their music came from as well.
Yeah, especially on the new record, you mix soul and jazz music. Where would you see the link between the two historically?
Well, most of the musicians on the sessions were jazz musicians. When you look back, pretty much everybody on Motown was a jazz musician, and all these other cats that we're talking about either came from jazz or the church or both. So it's kind of a blending of those two things into more of a pop sensibility that made soul music, basically. But like James Jamerson, he basically is using like upright bass technique on the electric, which is why it sounds so different and his lines sound so different. It's because he's using a jazz theory. And that's really like the secret connection, Quincy Jones, all these kind of people, they had the harmonic language to provide like the frame for the backdrop, really, for the singer. You know what I mean? So it was really, it's like the secret weapon of soul music.
Yeah. And do you have any idea about the early jazz culture? We read it was pretty liberal and open-minded, not only in terms of music but also sexuality.
But jazz culture?
Yeah, the early jazz culture.
Back like when?
Like in the 20s or.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, jazz was like, that was like the freshest music of the time, So it also happened in places where you could be more free, like in Harlem, where the laws were more relaxed. You could have black and white people hanging out, drugs, sex, whatever. It was kind of like good time music, you know what I mean? And now it's kind of changed into classical music or something.
Do you see any parallel between the summer of love hippies and the early jazz scene?
I never thought about it, but I think there's a connection in just the sense where people are always looking for some kind of freedom, you know, of every generation. You know, maybe right now it's like still raves and like Flying Lotus, Brain Feeder, the kind of like kids can go and wild out and just rebel against being old, I think, really, you know. So I think, yeah, jazz was that, and for that moment, you know, I think anytime people are like excited about music, it's good, you know, and it's more powerful when it turns into a movement, which I think we're like on the cusp of something interesting right now too. I can kind of feel like a big shift in the industry and also in how people consume music. So it's more digital, but there's still that movement there. Yeah.
What can you tell us about the Coltrane record, Love Supreme? It is his most successful record. What makes it so good?
It's a great question. I mean, I thought about that a lot, and I don't think I can say in words, but I think when an artist sort of goes beyond themselves and asks the divine for like inspiration or guidance, because when I listen to the album, I don't necessarily hear Coltrane. I feel like I hear God talking. When I hear like What's Going On, which apparently was made in 10 days, you know that there's something magical happening. And you can't really describe what it is, but I feel like it's when the universe sort of gets involved and becomes the producer of the album, sort of, and just sort of handles it, you know, and you feel something more than music from these kind of albums.
Yeah. This record was published in the 60s. In which ways does it match into this period? Would you consider it as spiritual?
I think people were just learning about other cultures in America, especially. They were learning about Africa. They were learning about Eastern philosophy. That was like a big thing. So it was just going around like vegetarianism, transcendental meditation, all these just were like huge new concepts. I mean, I think it just kind of grabbed the public attention in general, you know, and it filtered through, you know, jazz and then into rock, and psychedelic rock and all this stuff. So I think it's hard now because it's not that nothing is new, but things come and go so fast. You know, for example, James Blake's album just came out, but so many people already had heard it and reviewed it and either liked or disliked it before it was even sold, you know what I mean? So there's no kind of like waiting anymore. Like when I was, you know, a teenager, if you wanted to buy like the new Nirvana album, you had to go wait, you had to go to the record store, wait, get it, hope it wasn't sold out, you know what I mean? Yeah. Actually buy it, the cassette or CD, and listen to it. You couldn't really duplicate it, couldn't pass it to your friends. You had to come and listen together. So I think kind of what's changed is more, this is the era of like individuals. You can share music, but people don't really listen to music together anymore. I mean, one of the best things I did with my album was I got it on vinyl, and it's 4 sides, it's a double LP. And I listened with my band and my engineer in the studio, and you have to turn it over, you know, and you talk about it, like, oh yeah, like, it just slows down the process, and you have to do it together, which I think is cool. So I think it's not that people are less spiritual, I just think we've changed the way we consume music and information, and it's so much faster now. And I think people wanted to use any platform they had to sort of advance music. And you know, it's kind of hard for people to remember, but jazz was the popular music of the world at one point. Definitely, you know, through 20s, 30s, even into the 40s, there wasn't really any other popular music, you know, that existed. Then as, you know, things got more kind of, different styles started coming in, rock slowly started to come in. There's just a lot of pressure for change, you know. And I think one of the biggest ways that jazz helped was using that stature as like cultural ambassadors, like State Department tours and things like that, talking about issues. Even Louis Armstrong talked about issues, which was big. So it definitely helped move things forward. And I think artists are and comedians as well, some of the few people in society that are pretty free to say whatever they want and have a voice. So it was important then and it is now as well.
Okay. And in hip hop, we find really strong male characters. Why do you think your smooth and not really aggressively male approach does not apply to R&B and hip hop?
I think people historically, like, the male R&B singer has been vulnerable. You know, he's a seducer of women, obviously, but of people. You know, musically, it's a soothing voice. It's a Marvin Gaye. It's a Al Green. It's a whisper. It's bedroom music. You know, women. It's music that women want to listen to. Hip hop is music that dudes want to listen to mostly. You know what I mean? Yeah. And like, guys don't love R&B, but they love women who love R&B. Do you know what I mean? So it's a different thing. The target is just women. You know, I was talking to Robert Glasper, and I was like, when I sing on stage, I'm singing to a woman, whether she's in the room or not. You know, I'm singing to that energy because you're trying to seduce that energy, whether it's the muse or an actual person or whatever. You know, like if my wife is in the room, I'm singing to her directly. You know what I mean? So it's just a different thing, and I think it's a special thing, like that male vulnerability that, you know, especially Marvin Gaye had or Sam Cooke had, because it's like tough but tender at the same time, which is a hard balance, you know. But I think it's important that there's like a lot of, you know, varieties of kind of examples how to be masculine in the world, so you can kind of get a lot of references and choose your own way.
And we have no idea about it. Could you explain where the rhythm of funk music come from? How did they develop?
Well, I'm not like an ethnomusicologist, you know, but I think, you know, things happen from a lot of different combinations, you know, like I think, you know, James Brown's background, for example, he knew a lot about jazz, you know. I mean, in a way, he was kind of like playing a jazz big band. And there was just like a curious shift, you know, with people like Elvis as well, were playing big bands. And in like late 40s, 50s, and then it started to shift into rock. There was something that kind of happened where I think the music shot off in all these different ways, but it still had that power of like the big ensemble. But things kind of shifted back to the rhythm section. And I think that's where it comes from, really, you know, like the guitar part and how the things interlocked so well, you know. I don't know like the exact timing, like the combination, but they just found that groove somehow, you know, and it felt funky, you know.
Would you say that the 70s soul featured a more feeling-based attitude also in male music and voices?
Well, I think what changed was before the 70s, but the LP. You know, all of a sudden you could make a huge album. You could do this whole, you could do a novel instead of just a short story. So, you know, Barry White and Marvin, all these people started experimenting with this kind of long form, like almost like a suite, you know. And I think every art form just develops from what happened before it. You know? So you had what's going on, you had all these things that start to unfold and tell a longer story, get more social. You had Stevie Wonder writing these more complicated forms, using more jazz harmony and stuff. So I think all that precedent was kind of there, and then the technology kind of opened it up so you could do it. You know what I mean? Also, once an album sells well, like what's going on, then the industry says, okay, there's room for this. You know what I mean? Like Black Radio, the success of that album by Robert Glasper paved the way for this album, No Beginning, No End. Hopefully this album will help, some other albums as well, and just on and on and on.
And which of the following musical elements influenced you either on your new record and you as a musician? I name you 5 different people, and you tell me how they influenced you and your new record. Okay.
Okay.
The first is Tony Haddaway.
Donnie, just his voice is just beautiful. I love the way he lives in a track. Singers kind of like live in tracks differently. Some with confidence, some very shy. And Donnie's just right in the middle, super focused and very spiritual. So I think that's his influence.
Oh, okay. The next is Isaac Hayes.
Isaac Hayes would be the sex, the pure like abandon, he really draws you into that world, like severely. Once you press play, you're just in it, you know what I mean? Which is a beautiful thing.
And Curtis Mayfield?
Curtis was more on the social tip, he always, actually the song I wrote with Pino, Make It Right, which was the first song on the album, kind of references that. We were like, yeah, this could have been like a Curtis lyric, you know what I mean, when we first got together.
And Stevie Wonder?
Stevie, again, that's the harmonic sensibility, that jazz advanced harmony that Robert Glasper brought, like on a song like Vanguard, for example.
So, what are the most important musical changes in soul music of the 80s for you?
I think it's always about the technology, really, like, it's always the beat and technology. So, you have drum machines, you have different sounds. I'm from Minneapolis, so of course I had Prince and The Time and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis and all of that. And it's very much about production, it's very much about the sound, making a statement as a producer, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Which I think that was a reaction from disco, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
An interesting way, like, I tend to think of production as being very cold, but 80s is very kind of warm, for me. The drum sound is not warm, but somehow like the soul music is warm. And now people are like going back to that now. People like, Dang Funk, revisiting that sound. So it's kind of interesting, you know what I mean? Definitely not something that I want to go back to. Maybe it's just because I grew up in it as a kid. So it doesn't feel like fresh to me, but I definitely respect it for what it was. I love the songwriting of the late 60s and 70s. I just think that there was a better balance of like black and white artists in the US that kind of referenced each other. And you still have the idea of a song stylist, like a Roberta Flack. She wasn't necessarily one thing or the other. She wasn't jazz or pop or soul. She was just Roberta Flack, or Carole King or someone like that. So I find that more interesting. Or Donnie as well, he wrote this beautiful, basically symphony to open, his debut album. When you think about people today, it's a little different. And to me, it seems a little more narrow in terms of like musical background and what they want to do. And I think the way that things are marketed is very different as well. It's like, okay, it's R&B, so it's got to be this small, and it's got to get played on these 5 radio stations, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Back then, it was kind of like, oh, let's make an album. It's beautiful. Put strings on it. That's amazing. And people just like it because it's good music. So that's really why I like that time. I'm not nostalgic, but I do kind of miss the kind of like if you watch the Grammys from the '70s, people would sing each other's songs. The best song of the year, the presenter would sing it, you know, which, wow. I mean, I can't even imagine the patience and the time now. It's just like you get up, you have your 30 seconds and you're off, you know what I mean? So I just feel like back then it was more about people just really loving music and trying to just make the musical scene better all around instead of just getting rich.
Yeah. So, what do you feel when you listen to Prince? If You Was My Girlfriend?
Well, when I hear Prince, what I always think of is just his playing, man. I mean, it's funny because I was thinking about that song yesterday, or maybe it was this morning, because Justin Bieber did the If I Was Your Boyfriend.
Yeah.
It's a very similar kind of vibe, you know, slightly rip off, whatever, but I mean, Prince is always just so weird and freaky that I'm like, I don't try to understand what he means by it all, but his production and his guitar playing is just so ridiculous. And of course his voice is like some other alien soul prophet or something, you know what I mean? So it's really like the whole thing, you know what I mean, when I listen to Prince.
Do you think that either Michael Jackson or Lionel Richie had a choice of where their musical career could go?
I think you always have a choice, you know. But sometimes a choice means less money, and some people don't want that. You know, I think after a certain point, it becomes more of a choice between fame and music, because you know you have people. Well, I mean, Michael's a great example where obviously his music was fantastic, but his fame, his stardom, really overshone his music, you know, as a musician, just writing stuff. It happened to Nat King Cole as well. You know, he was just a jazz pianist, and then he became this huge singer and couldn't do that anymore. He had to have a TV show and do all this stuff. So I think you always have decisions, and obviously Michael made a lot of decisions about how he wanted his music, but the fame definitely shapes that. You know, I think that's what D'Angelo was reacting against, even still. You know, I think he really wants to protect his music, and I don't think he wanted to be that famous. It was too much.
Anything about the next 5 persons? The first is Louis Jordan. What do you think about it?
Louis Jordan?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, he's that jump blues dude, you know, so he really popularized a different form of jazz, you know, and he really brought it into like more dance, more entertainment, and early prototype R&B, and I think he's dope.
And
he's an amazing performer as well. Yeah.
And Dinah Washington?
Dinah was one of the people like Nina Simone or there's Nancy Wilson, real hybrid artists, you know, and I consider myself one as well, who sort of embody different worlds. They kind of live between worlds. You know, she could sing serious blues or gospel, she could sing pop, and she could sing jazz as well. And I was lucky enough to work with Junior Mance on piano, who used to be her pianist back in the day. So a real strong connection to her. Like, she was one of my big influences as a singer.
And Ruth Brown?
Ruth Brown?
Yeah.
Amazing singer. Like, just a lot of sensitivity and a lot of, I guess, like, the word I want to use is poetry. You know, like, very, just direct and compelling. Yeah.
And Jackie Wilson?
Jackie Wilson was just like the ultimate star, you know, of that. Like, he really had an operatic voice and so much energy, you know, and tragic life, you know, but just amazing. I think a benchmark for black music, absolutely.
And the last one is Sam Cooke.
Sam Cooke, man, it's like, again, you know, another tragic life cut too soon. You know, when I think of Sam, I think of just joy. You know, whenever I feel him singing, he really had a joy for the music and for his people and for the song. Even when he was singing something sad, it's still the underlying feeling to me is like a joyful one. He's a true legend.
Okay. So one last question. Robert Glasper told us in an interview that Kanye West brought back soul music and hip hop after the new soul movement had come down, because Kanye started sampling classic soul and R&B music again. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think he's spot on, man. I mean, Glasper definitely knows. I mean, it's funny, Kanye's from Chicago too, so that's a soulful spot. You know, I'm from Minneapolis, and I think the Midwest respects soul music a lot, you know, because we relate to coming to it. Soul is not necessarily like slick. It's not necessarily like big city music. You know, it's got some like of the country cousin in it. So yeah, Kanye definitely brought that back. And like I said, you know, a lot of young people, they don't know these artists. You know, they need to get introduced. The way that I was introduced to jazz, they need to get introduced to soul, R&B. And yeah, he definitely put it down. He's actually one of my favorite producers in terms of just making beats. He's dope. I think that music is a beautiful journey, and it never stops. You know, you should always try to seek out new artists because they're always there. You know, there's always some kid in Denmark or in Brooklyn, you know what I mean, trying to do something fresh. And I think it's important to remember it's not about the age of the artist. You know, sometimes older people they say, oh, he's too young or she's too young. But genius like strikes at any time, you know, so I always try to keep my ears open, look for new stuff, and try to keep inspired, because that's the point of music of any kind. It's here to inspire us as a humanity towards being more creative, more positive, more joyful.